We got an official spring game date for the OU Sooners. Welcome in Sooner Nation to the Voice of College Football and our weekly Oklahoma show right here on our scheduled time, Wednesday, 11:30 a.m. Central Time. 48 consecutive weeks we've done this, courtesy, of course, the guy that makes it all happen, Jason Ray. Last word on college football. Jason, how's it going today?
Doing great, Mark. How are you, sir?
I'm good. I'm good, although it felt like spring the last couple of days, but this is typical Connecticut weather. It's not spring. It's you get a couple teases, and it looks like it might as well be mid-January right now. The snow is coming down.
I know it's actually even supposed to snow here in Oklahoma. I think this weekend, Thursday night into Friday, a little bit. So, yeah, just the last little. Usually, Oklahoma gets a little bit of a snow thing in March, early March. It seems like, and then it's kind of full speed ahead with spring and summer.
Yeah, we're not quite out of the woods, but we will get there. And to help us kind of count down the days, the spring game has been announced for 3 o'clock Central Time on April 23rd, and festivities surrounding the spring game and a unique unveiling as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So, we talked a little bit about this previously. Had an idea that probably was April the 23rd. I think actually a parent had kind of tweeted that out. I think a little bit prematurely, but yeah, it was made official this past week, April 23rd at 3 p.m. And then the Baker Mayfield statue will be unveiled as well. So I've already seen a number of previous players that have already tweeted out talking about how excited they are to come back, and I think that's the one thing. The one There's many, but one of the many differences between the previous regime and this regime is they have done a really good job at welcoming past players back, to be part of the program, part of that soul program that Brent Venables has instituted, but just as well as being back in part of the Oklahoma program. So there's a lot of obviously there's tons of excitement for that, and I think that the Baker Mayfield statue just kind of added on to that. And outside of that as well, the official start of spring practice is going to be Tuesday, March 22nd. So a little less than 2 weeks away from getting it cranked up for spring. So it's not quite fall, but it's something, right? It's actually some semblance of football practice starting back up again. So really exciting stuff.
I was going to say it's at least guys hitting each other, but that doesn't even happen for quite some time. So it's guys in their jerseys running around. Then they'll eventually get the shells on and get the pads on, and they'll hit a little bit at some point. But yeah, the guys on the field working out, hitting blocking sleds, and throwing 7-on-7 drills in the passing game. So good stuff coming up here just in a couple of weeks, and we will do our best to get as much information out of camp as possible. The two things that come to mind in regards to what you just mentioned regarding the statue, and then also regarding the connection with the past and bringing those successful players back onto campus. The latter portion of that, bringing the players back onto campus, having them show up for events, spring game, actual games in the fall, all of that seems obvious. That like you don't have to have half a brain to understand. We are trying to attract attention. We are trying to show recruits that we turn football players into successes at the next level. That your best example of that, case in point, boom, Baker Mayfield, Kyler Murray. We could go on down the line, of course. CD Lamb. There you go. Let's bring the stars back and show what you could become. That seems like the obvious endorsement.
Yeah, no, you absolutely would think so, Mark. And I think just we talked a little bit about this, before we came on, but there's a lot of different feel to what this Oklahoma program is about right now than where it was. I think it's much more about the relationships that not only that Brent Venables and the staff is forging with the current team, but some of the relationships that he's had previously with some of those kids when obviously he was at Oklahoma. So I think Just the fact that a lot of these guys are talking about how much they want to be part of the program, again, want to come back for this is it's yes, it is a no-brainer. You would think that that would be something that would have happened in the previous regime, and I don't necessarily know, Mark, that they weren't necessarily, involved or are allowed to be back, but I don't think it's at the level that it is now. I think it's more of a family type of culture than it has been in the past. And so you can see that with some of the things that some of the interviews and things that Venables has talked about, just early on, even before, some of this stuff happens, in terms of getting spring practice and all that going. And so, yeah, it's a different feel, but I think it's always a great, situation, something that's very that recruits see that you're bringing back these past players. They're involved, not just coming to games, but they're involved. They're on the sidelines. You know, they feel part of the action, which is something, like I said, something that's been missing for this program for the last 4 or 5 years.
And then, Jason, with the unveiling of the statue of Baker Mayfield, what comes to mind, and this is not important, and it's petty for anyone that processes this, but comes to mind that, okay, Baker Mayfield gets a statue. Who else deserves a statue? I'm sure there's conversation out there, if not debate, as to, well, if he deserves a statue, who else deserves a statue? Who makes that determination? Is there some kind of set criteria? There's 7 Heisman Trophy winners, for one thing. So just that came to mind in regards to, okay, that was the first thing that came to mind. I saw that news and I thought, okay, Baker Mayfield gets a statue. I get it. He had a legendary career, but who does and does not have statues at Oklahoma? That list could be pretty long.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting, Mark, to see how this kind of goes through the years. Right now the area where these statues are up is called Heisman Park around Oklahoma. So right now it's very specific to the previous Heisman winner. So to your point, I think Kyler Murray would logically have the next one. But yeah, I think it would be interesting at some point if Oklahoma decided to go go out a little bit in terms of moving that to not just Heisman but more some of the great All Americans that have been at Oklahoma. I'm sure that comment
Hokies.
kind of hurts you.
I'm sorry, what's that?
I'm sure this comment on the banner is bringing
I,
up bad memories.
Yes, it brings up some bad memories of a game that I thought was going to go in the win column for the other team. But considering what had happened the year before and just where I thought the teams were at that point, but Oklahoma and Baker Mayfield obviously gave a butt kicking, especially in the fourth quarter, as a 1-point Ohio State lead sometime in the fourth quarter. And then Oklahoma took it from there, 31-16. And yes, Baker Mayfield, Okie had a nice, rather amusing comment there, that the criteria for planning or for the statue unveiling is, of course, planting a flag, which, to be technical, he couldn't plant the flag because it's artificial turf. It just kind of like dropped as soon as he hit the turf. But yeah, that was a big win for OU and Bob Stoops in 2017. All right, folks, we got people filing in here. Leave your comments and questions. We're talking Oklahoma football, of course, for the next 45 or 50 minutes. Jason Ray's here. He makes it all happen. Catch his work on Last Word on College Football. All right. You had checked out, and you've referenced this podcast a number of times in regards to gaining quite a bit of insight. And Brent Venables was part of it this week in a rather interesting conversation.
Yeah, it really was, Mark. Gabe Eichert and Teddy Lehman have had an Oklahoma Breakdown podcast. It's been going for a while. Some of the things in season, they have a little bit more X's and O's commentary just in terms of, how things were going from week to week. And so during the off season, they typically have a lot of different guests that will come on and talk. And it was a little not really surprising that that Venables would be a guy that would come on very, very early on in the process. But to put this in a little bit of a different train of thought, that under the previous regime, Gabe Ikard and Teddy Lehman, they weren't even. I mean, and keep in mind they worked for the University of Oklahoma on the radio, on the radio call, and they weren't even allowed to be part of practice at all, not even just to look or watch. And so I think the difference is, in Gabe and Teddy really never had any kind of a personal conversation with Lincoln ever. And then initially, when Venables was announced as the head coach, he went and talked to both of them, and kind of asked them all how their family was doing and how this was going. And it just kind of points to the difference in the mindset. So I say that to say, yeah, he came on and he spoke for, gosh, Mark, I think about an hour and 15, hour and 20 minutes with them, and understanding how busy, even in the spring, how busy a head coach is at a major university. With everything that he's got to go through and what he's got on his plate right now, especially being a first time head coach. I'm sure things are spinning for him to a certain degree, right? And then so he like to spend that time, I thought was really interesting. And there was like 4 or 5 questions that he asked. And the first question was really just kind of talking about, like, how are you um, how are you adjusting to being a head coach, and starting your first spring, the whole process with bringing in your staff and everything going. And very interesting, just kind of hearing his approach. I think his approach was really around not necessarily focusing as much on the field right now, but more so preparing them for them for life in a lot of ways. Talking about Brent Venables is a guy that's very strong in his faith. Was talking about preparing these kids for life, not necessarily just football, but preparing them for life. Talking about obviously there's a small percentage of college athletes that actually make it to the next level, and whatever sport that is. And talking about, let's also prepare them for different aspects of what they're going to do with the rest of their life, because football will be there, but they still have a large majority of their life. So I think just understanding the kind of the human element of it um, was very interesting. And he has a presence about him, just the way he um, delivers everything. I mean, he's very much a kind of an old school, no nonsense, tough football coach. But I think at the end of the day, he's very relational. He really cares about the players and having those personal relationships with the players. And you could see that by all of the kids that are wanting to come back and wanting to be part of this program, that were previously played for him back in the 1999 to about 2011, I think, is when he left to go to Clemson. So very, it was very, I recommend that to anyone that hasn't had an opportunity to go watch it. Very engaging and very, me from a coaching perspective, there was a lot of things that I took into that, like, wow, that's a great approach to have with your kids. That's a great way to talk about that, in terms of worrying about the X's and O's will come. Spring practice will come. There's a lot of stuff, but make sure that we're prepared both mentally and physically for what we need to do. And talked a lot about the differences in where they were at when they came in 1999 versus where they were at coming in this year, about how Oklahoma's in a much better spot to be successful, not only short term but long term, as opposed to where they were in '99. Was really didn't really hold anything back, talking about how much of a mess this program was in 1999, and said, yeah, there's some things that we need to do differently now, but overall in a much better situation than where they were here in 2022, as opposed to where they were in 1999. So I think that was interesting to see. And then obviously a lot of people care about the on the field stuff, and didn't get into a whole lot of that, but talked about a couple of things that really that he wanted to focus on, is really approaching every day the right way, right? You've got to move the needle. Really got to move the needle forward each and every day. Doesn't have to be big moves, but it has to be moving in the right direction, type of situation. And then also really, just talking about how important it is for the installation of both on the offense and defensive side of the ball as well. So very, very interesting and very, like I said, something you didn't really see. He went above and beyond in the when the recruiting class was announced, talking, had a couple of media sessions. So I think this is a guy that wants to do everything the right way.
Yeah, very impressive to hear from Brent Venables and to really take into account what he has to say on really any subject. He's a well thought out individual in regards to not just giving you the typical coach speak, but really sharing what's on his mind and his heart regarding football approach on the field, but more importantly, everything else that surrounds what he's trying to accomplish with these young men. So really good stuff there.
Yeah, and
We've got to go ahead, Jason.
well, I was just going to say it's one of those things that is really it's very much permeating through the program right now. Not only this year, but when you look at some of the some of the kids that Oklahoma was recruiting, even from a transfer portal perspective, they were very, and these are kids that didn't end up going to Oklahoma. They were very, very positive about the culture that has already been, kind of laid forth in Norman already. And then some of the 2023, 24 kids that Oklahoma had on site was really very, very complimentary. So it's very, I think, easy to see that everyone's on the same page from a culture perspective, how they want to treat their players, what they're trying to build from a program perspective as well. And I think there's some coaches that were part of that and said it's much more organized. It's in a much better state than it has ever been in terms of exactly knowing what the vision is for this program.
Yeah, to see what Bob Stoops accomplished quickly in reference to what Brent Venables said about the 1999 team. And I remember that a little bit better than maybe some people that, not talking about Sooner fans, but just talking about your average college football fan, because I was covering the SEC. And Ole Miss was one of the primary teams we were covering, and they played an Independence Bowl game against that Bob Stoops team his first year. And anybody who's a college football fan that wasn't around in the 90s, go back and look at Oklahoma's record during the 90s. It's not going to look recognizable. A lot of 500, sub 500 seasons in the 90s. They went 7-5, I believe, the season in which Bob Stoops took over year number one, and then boom, they vault to a national championship. I hear this now. I will take into consideration that a lot of our viewer base, and we appreciate them here at the Voice of College Football, are Miami and Florida State fans who tend to mock this 2000 national championship by Oklahoma because it wasn't the prettiest, most prolific football you will ever see on the offensive side of the ball. But, Miami fans will argue that, oh, well, our team was so talented, so full of NFL players that we would have, mopped the field with Oklahoma and won that game by a zillion points. Okay. Well, you weren't good enough to beat the teams that you needed to beat. You lost a game. You played a down to the wire game against Florida State, and they turned around and they couldn't put up an offensive point against Oklahoma. So I don't know what leads you to believe that, I think teams that win, quote unquote, ugly get a bad mark because people aren't looking at play in the trenches. They aren't looking at they just, okay, since they didn't have a 1,000-yard receiver, they must be no good. Right. And then it was actually amusing the other day. I had a conversation with a Florida State guy that I have on, and he actually said, we were better in 2000. We really were the best team. And I'm like, I understand the best team doesn't always win the game. And so we can all have our certain preferences and say, I understand that was the result, but I still think that team was better. I get that, but when you don't score a point on offense and you lose the game in shutout fashion, I know the final score was 13-2, but my point is couldn't score a point on offense against the Oklahoma defense. Man, that's a tough sell that you're the better team.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I don't know that Mark, if they would have played 8 quarters, if Florida State would have ever scored in that game. Oklahoma had
Yeah.
it was, one of the, at least in my lifetime watching Oklahoma football, it was one of the, probably the best single defensive performance I've seen out of an Oklahoma football team. And so yeah, they were dominant, especially throughout the game. And I know Oklahoma didn't score a whole lot in that game, but for most people, most Oklahoma people know this, but um, Josh Heupel was, I don't think he could have broken glass with a football with it. He was so he was so injured with his throwing hand. Most people, he had a bursa sac issue with his
I
I think
remember.
his elbow, so he couldn't get much on the ball at all, and struggled a little bit down the stretch. But yeah, I mean, I think they knew that they were going to have to win that game in somewhat um, of a low scoring fashion. And yeah, the defense just played outstanding in that game. And yeah, I'm with
Yeah.
you. I don't know that you never know on situations are different and if one team plays the other team. But I stand by the fact that I don't think Florida State probably would have scored, if anything, not much if they would have played 8 full quarters.
And it was really impressive, especially at the time, because Florida State was one of those schools that you were just amazed and wowed by all the speed, the Florida speed that would go to the NFL. And Chris Winkie won the Heisman Trophy, threw for a zillion yards and touchdowns and all that. So you tend to get enamored with that. And so going into the game, they were a favorite over Oklahoma, who was the team that was more in the trenches, workmanlike, and lunch pail team that obviously was a much better team on the field. All right, folks, appreciate you all being here for Oklahoma Sooners Live. And of course, if you just got here, wait for the video to process and post after the show's over, and you can catch what you missed. We talked about the Baker Mayfield statue, Brent Venables' conversation on the Eichert and Lehman show. Did I
Yeah.
get that right?
So yeah,
Podcast.
it's called Oklahoma Breakdown. Yeah.
Okay, Oklahoma breakdown, and a few other things. So check that out.
Yeah.
Few few people in the chat have brought up the upcoming decision by the Overton brothers, and I know Jason, you were going to address where they stand.
Yeah, so just found out a couple of days ago that they're taking their official visit to Oklahoma on April 23rd, so the spring game. They're going to be there, and so it's a little bit. I think most people know, but following the recruitment of Levias Overton and then his older brother Micaiah Overton, they're pretty much a package deal at this point. Levias reclassified. He was a 2023 kid, reclassified to the 2022 class fairly late in the recruiting cycle. So I think, and the fact that his brother had, hit the transfer portal, there was a thought there that that it was going to be a package situation, and so. There's 5 or 6 schools in the mix, but I think there's really only two. I think Oregon and Oklahoma are the two because they are the only two that have offered both. Now, should somebody like A&M or should someone like Alabama or somebody decide to offer both of these kids, now maybe there's a different player there. But like Oklahoma's chances here, it wasn't something that I was super optimistic about early on in the process. I thought that he was most likely bound for Texas A&M, but I think based on the fact that Oklahoma and Oregon, for that matter, are the only ones that have offered both of these kids, and the fact that their father, both of the obviously the kid's father played at Oklahoma in the 90s, I believe it was, and so this is specifically Levias. I think he's probably a little bit of a better prospect right now than his brother. But I think he's a guy that could potentially play very very early on for Oklahoma on that defensive line in a spot where at least be in that rotation. I know it's going to be hard for a kid like that because he's obviously not going to come in until the summer. But both of those kids. But I think I would lean a little bit more towards Oklahoma right now at this point.
So the higher rated of the two, that would be Labias Overton, I believe. So he is. So we're talking the 2022 class.
Yeah.
So everybody was signed for the most part. When I say everybody, obviously not everybody, but 99% signed and off the board back in February. So you still have him as the top 5 rated defensive lineman, basically top 6 in the country. And then also the top offensive tackle in the country, he's still on the board. Connerly's his last name, out of the state of Washington. So it's just kind of odd that 2 guys are still out there. That happened a little bit more frequently because of COVID and the pandemic and the lack of visits last year. But to see 2 guys of that caliber still on the board. And my most obvious question was going to be, but you cleared it up for us, and some of my research as well, was 2 brothers from Georgia. Why are they looking at Oklahoma and Oregon? Well, the legacy connection, as you just outlined. Then, of course, you got to think that Dan Lanning, being the defensive coordinator at Georgia, who had highly recruited them on that side of the football, boom, he's gone to Oregon to become the head coach. So there's the obvious tie there.
Yeah, and like I said, it's a position of need, really for Oklahoma. I mean, Labias is such a great prospect. He's a take guy, regardless of if it's a real need or not. But yeah, no, I think that's going to be really important. And the Connerly kid, I know Oklahoma's in on. I don't necessarily love Oklahoma's chances of getting him right now, but Oklahoma still is in the mix for him as well. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. And they're Venables and the team has really talked a lot about being still continuing to be aggressive in the transfer portal. So wouldn't be surprised at all to see if kind of Oklahoma gets in the mix with some of that stuff post spring, right? Because there's going to be some kids that are not happy with where they're at from a playing time perspective and the depth chart side as well. So there'll be obviously a lot of activity, and I think Oklahoma is going to continue to be, maybe not necessarily will be this way going forward, but based on kind of the timing and how everything happened, I think Oklahoma will continue to be pretty aggressive into that transfer portal.
Appreciate everyone being here for our Oklahoma show. We come your way every Wednesday at 11:30 a.m. Central Time. Please subscribe, hit that bell for the notifications. That way you know when we go live, because sometimes the schedule needs to change. So keep that in mind. And appreciate everyone being here. We've got a Discord that we started 2 weeks ago. So what that is basically a big chat room. And we opened that up 2 weeks ago. Go to Patreon, search Mark Rogers TV. We get you the link right there. So again, go to Patreon, search Mark Rogers TV. We'll send you a link to hook you up with all sorts of college football fans on our Discord. And I jump in there once a day myself and respond to whatever you guys are talking about. All right. So let's see. We are sitting here on March 9th. Next Wednesday will be the 16th. So then the next Wednesday, we may not necessarily have news out of spring practice, but it'll be 2 to 3 days in the mix at that point.
Yeah.
And we'll see how Brent Venables conducts spring practice as compared to Lincoln Riley.
Yeah, I think the one thing that you can count on, and I know all coaches are a little bit, I think, creatures of habit in terms of they don't want to allow too much access, just because there's so much technology out there and there's so much, just kind of ability to share some of that information that you don't necessarily want to be shared. But I do think that Oklahoma, the mainstream media will have a little bit more access than probably, what they've had in the past, and a little bit. I think two things that you notice out of the previous regime was that one, Riley was very, I think he was very unwilling to let much many people, if anybody, in to watch practice and be around that. But I think also he was very paranoid in terms of, what he might say. So it was very, very um, even above and beyond coach speak that you would see. And I think the one thing in listening to um, to some of the speaking engagements that Brent Venables has been a part of, whether it be the podcast or whether it be, kind of media availability or whatever that might be. He's very, I mean, again, he's gonna hold a lot of things to himself, but I think at the same time he's more willing to just kind of be honest and say what the state of his team is, and if he's happy, if he's unhappy, where do they need to have some improvement. So I would expect us to have a little bit more um, intel, so to speak, than we've had in the past. So yeah, look forward to that. It's, like I said, there's you can go, and I think this can be said, I think, for any spring, but I think more so this year because of all the newness. You can go into any positional unit and kind of talk through, you know, that there's going to be key battles, and in a lot of the different positional groups, specifically because of all the turnover from players, and whether it was players moving on from a transfer portal perspective, whether it was players moving to the NFL or whatever that might be. So yeah, there's a lot of intriguing areas to kind of think about and talk through when it comes to the spring practice.
And it sounds like, Jason, based on some of the feedback we get from the strength and conditioning program, that some of these players may show up and look a little different.
Yeah, I think so. I think one of the prevailing comments that I've heard is the staff is over and above thrilled with the buy-in that these players have provided early on. And so I think what's happened, and it'll continue to kind of ramp up, and the winter workouts aren't anywhere near as strenuous and tough as the summer workouts are going to be. Part of it's weather, right? But I think other parts of it is, it's a slow kind of ramp up to what that will look like. And so, no, I think you're right, Mark. I think you'll see, and I don't know how much it'll be seen in the spring game, but I think definitely when you start seeing some of these kids in the fall, it'll be much more apparent. But yeah, no, I think, and there's a few kids that Venables and team have even pointed out as, kind of separating themselves as more leaders on the offense and defensive side. Dylan Gabriel has been one that's been mentioned. Eric Gray has been another one that has been mentioned. Interestingly enough, one of the guys on the offense that's been mentioned is the transfer from Cal. Caden Tower is one of those. He's a 3-year starter for Cal, and kind of expected to fill one of those roles on the guard, the offensive guard for Oklahoma. He's been a guy that's been pointed out, and then you've got some guys like Justin Broyles that's been there for a while. Not extremely surprising, but he's a guy that has improved so much, and he got on the field quite a bit last year. So some of these guys that have it's kind of interesting that some of these guys that have been transferring in. I mean, you kind of expected a little bit from a quarterback perspective. You kind of expect that. You expect that guy to be the leader of the offense, and so I think it's no surprise that Gabriel has kind of separated himself. But I think it's really interesting to see some of these guys, be. And I think based on the way this was, I used the term before, and I think it was something that was used. That I think it makes sense. I think when you look at it, and it's more so kind of a country club atmosphere. You saw that some of these kids, from everything that I've heard, the last few years, or some of these kids would finish their workout, and then they'd be done, and then they would dancing around and playing around, and it was just it's not as disciplined, not as regimented as it needed to be. So I think that's one thing that you're going to see from this team this year. Is I think you're going to see more of a no nonsense approach. You're going to see more of a tough approach, and I think you're going to see more of a mentally a stronger team than you've seen in the past, and much more aggressive, much more physical at the point of attack on both sides of the line.
What comes to mind when you mention what the environment, the culture was like under Lincoln Riley, and certainly not taking anything away from him. He's a tremendous football coach, but even people outside the USC camp. So you understand USC fans being optimistic, if not delirious, about Lincoln Riley arriving. I get it. At the same time, he's not the perfect football coach, and I think I see it from all over the place. And again, not just USC fans, but assuming that USC is going to be back. And I don't, even in that conference, I don't know for sure that that's going to be the case.
Yeah, I think it's going to be very interesting to see what that program looks like. I know there's a lot of hype for them. This is a team. We talk about this every year. There's teams that are going to be ranked in the top 25, top 15 based on hype, based on previous, maybe not even previous success, but just based on the possibilities. I would not at all be surprised to see USC as a top 15 team in the preseason next year. Now, having said that, this team has loads. This team is going to have loads of talent at the skill position side, right? They return a really solid offensive line. They've got the quarterback. They've got the skill position. But to your point, you still got to play a little bit of defense, even in the Pac-12, right? I mean, it's known as the Big 12 and the Pac-12 were kind of lumped together, but the Big 12 has kind of separated itself over the last couple of years of kind of
Yeah.
returning to more of a stronger defensive conference, whereas the Pac-12 is still kind of in that kind of in that disclaimer there of being more of a kind of a back and forth type of a league. So, what I would worry about if I was a USC fan is they don't have a lot of talent returning on the defensive side of the ball. And they've not really recruited that well on the defensive side. They've got a couple of kids in the 2022 cycle, but um, for them, are they going to be able to play enough defense to win? I mean, they're going to win, Mark. I'm confident. Not necessarily just this year, but as over the few years, they're going to win. But are they going to be able to do? Are they going to be able to play defense anywhere near the level that they did in the Pete Carroll era? Because I think that's where USC wants to get back to, obviously, right? Competing on a national level, and specifically next year, I don't know that their defense is good enough to not only win the Pac-12, but even make some noise nationally.
Absolutely. I was just trying to track down the numbers. I know that their defense was bottom 2 in the Pac-12 in points per game and yards per game allowed. So, man, again, in that conference, if you're finishing behind the likes of Arizona's Washington State, other schools like that, you would think that their defense alone or their talent alone on both sides of the ball would equal 8-4 without even blinking in that conference. But man, they lost some ugly games to some bad football teams. Shoot, Stanford had them down by 28 points in the fourth quarter. Like they were losing games like that last year. So Lincoln Riley, I expect him to turn it around, but it may not just be a snap of your fingers, boom, we're 11-1 and off and running, even in that conference.
Yeah, no, you're exactly right. I
We'll
mean,
see.
but when you think of some of the top teams, UCLA was much better last year. You've got Oregon, that's obviously continues to be a mainstay, but they don't have there's not a lot of opposition, and I think that kind of points to the reason. One of the biggest reasons why Riley made the jump is that obviously felt like that was going to be for the future an easier path to challenge for national championships. So yeah, it kind of remains to be seen, but it'll be interesting. A lot of people around here will love to hate USC this year in the coming years, but I think it'll be interesting to see what it actually looks like on the field.
I'm in the process of ranking programs across the country all time, not as it stands right now. I did that a couple months ago after the season. I ranked all the FPS programs 130 all the way up to number one. But what I took on in the past couple of weeks is I looked at, first of all, I tried to figure out what's a fair criteria for ranking programs. So I went with 10, which includes winning percentage, all-time AP ranking points, uh, national championships, conference championships, uh, NFL draft selections, first round selections, All Americans, Heisman Trophy winners, um, and then major award winners. And I included every position, the major award at that position, and then also bowl wins and major bowl wins. I doubled up the point totals for the major bowl wins. And it's not a perfect system because you can have all sorts of things. First thing that comes to mind, winning percentage. Well, how tough was the schedule, of course. And, you could play a really good opponent in a non-major bowl and play an easier opponent in a major bowl. But let's face it, 90 some percent of the time, the better teams are in the major bowls. So I think over time, it's a pretty fair analysis. And I really wanted to weight it toward winning percentage, which I did. And some people are in support of, and other people criticizing me for redistributing national championships, because I just don't take them for what they are. That the AP told me that these teams won the national championship. I went year to year, went through all the national championships, and I just don't buy some of them. I just think some of them are so flawed. I did more adding to than subtracting from, thinking, okay, this team won the national championship. They went 12-1. And most of this obviously going on during the poll era, not since we've had a playoff, although I reworked the BCS championship game a number of times because I don't necessarily think that completely was fair either. But anyway, I did more adding to national championships because there would be a collection of like 11-1 teams. And you look at the schedules and think, why did this team get voted number one? Well, because somebody had to get voted number one. It doesn't take anything away from them. And then the other thing was I went back to 1869, which that's technically the first season of college football. Well, the first like 20 seasons are useless. They're just completely useless. Like there's like 4 teams playing. So one team's like 2-0 and the other team's like 1-1 and it's meaningless. So I got rid of that. Plus all the teams that are involved at that point are no longer relevant. So why even bother? I had to find a mark somewhere in the 20s that I was like comfortable with. Okay, this seems like a legitimate football season. So I went the last 100 years of national championships. So I put that link of the Big 12 program rankings. I'm going conference by conference. Then I'm going to throw it all together and list the rundown. So you guys can check it out, Oklahoma fans. I'm sure you'll be pleased with what you see in stacking up Oklahoma against the rest of the Big 12, even though Texas is the other issue is that obviously programs have switched conferences. So you would have like a 10-year project on your hands trying to track everybody's conference championships and their winning percentage and everything from conference to conference. So that said, most of the Texas championships come from the Southwest Conference, TCU's as well. Yeah. So the conference championship comparison is just what it is based on wherever those championships were brought from. So,
yeah, that's really interesting. I've been, I kind of started it, but I've stopped it. I'm going to revive it here a little bit. About 4 years ago, we put together at the last word on college football. We put together what we kind of. It's very much the same criteria that you're mentioning. You're calling it program rankings. We called it blue blood ranking. So very, very much the same thing on the national scale. So yeah, I think we're gonna do something very similar. So I think it'll be interesting when we kind of get it done on both sides to compare our notes and see where we're at. We can discuss that. But yeah, I think it's very. The approach is very interesting on your side, taking it from a conference level and then kind of making that a little bit bigger, obviously, and taking it at the national level because, yeah, it's a little bit of a project to your point on, looking at the conferences, when you have, because traditionally when you think of, obviously the Big Eight was more prevalent throughout the years than the Big 12 has been, just in terms of how long it's been how long it was a conference. And Oklahoma and Nebraska traditionally, like year in and year out, were the two teams that really dominated that conference. Colorado maybe to a little bit of a lesser extent, but then Texas had more conference championships, I'm sure, in the Southwest Conference versus what they've had in the Big 12. So yeah, that's a really interesting project. You've given me a little bit of a extra motivation here to kind of get on top of it a little bit faster.
What gets underlined as well is just the separation, and I'll give away the findings to a certain extent, but go check out the numbers. I think basically because of the last 15 years, I would have guessed, based on the numbers that I'm seeing, that Oklahoma, even 12 or 13 years ago, had a lead on Texas in most of these categories. But the lead has widened to where almost consistently through this, and I've done all the conferences, have not released the videos yet, just the Pac-12 and the Big 12. But you see, you're not going to see a team that leads the conference in winning percentage, but is like ninth in award winners at positions. It's very consistent that
Sure, yeah.
Oklahoma's number one in everything. Everything.
Yeah.
Major bowl wins. Texas ties them in bowl wins, but major bowl wins, winning percent, everything I just mentioned. And that even trickles down to award winners and All-Americans and draft picks. The NFL, they've got a 50-player lead in NFL draft selections, only 4 of a lead in first-round selections over Texas. But then you see Texas at number 2, and nobody's even close to them. You see this monumental drop off the cliff after them, and then you see the rest of the conference. I was surprised to see that Baylor's got the 3rd most NFL draft selections in history out of Big 12 schools.
Yeah, I definitely wouldn't have thought that. Interesting. And I'm sure a large majority of those are within the last 15 to 20 years, I would assume. I mean, obviously Singletary was one of the ones in the what?
He would have been 80.
I was going to say late 80s.
He was in that 85 Bears team, so I don't know what year he came out.
Interesting. Yeah. I was going to say when I did a little bit of research, I'd noticed that they were there. And I just didn't do it. I did it more from a national perspective, but they were there in the top 25. Over the last 10 or 15 years, in terms of draft picks. So.
And then, of course, TCU back in the Sammy Baugh days was phenomenal.
Yeah.
And then they had a big gap. And then they've been really good under Gary Patterson. So TCU and Oklahoma State are next in line. But that Oklahoma State, that's been lifted up. For as much as I give Mike Gundy some grief from time to time, it's, he's done a nice job there. And obviously they've put up a lot of their numbers. They gained just their 4th major bowl win this past season over Notre Dame in the Fiesta Bowl. And then at the bottom, Iowa State, Kansas, and Kansas State are just. And then if you would take out Bill Snyder's tenure at Kansas State.
Oh, my gosh.
Oh, if you go through Kansas State's records, like in the 60s, 70s, 80s into Bill Snyder, like they're going like 1-10 almost every year. It's like awful. It's just incredibly bad. And that Iowa State has only had 1 player selected in the first round of the NFL draft in history.
That's crazy. That's crazy to think that, over the years. I mean, I know they, in the in the same time period that you're mentioning Kansas State, I mean, Iowa State was, I mean, maybe not equally as bad, but they've had a bad program, for quite some time. But you would think after, from a, that there would be a couple of years here and there that you would just get lucky and develop a great player into a number 1 draft pick, but or a first round draft pick, I should say. And then, but No, some of those programs, I mean, in Kansas has went through ebbs and flows, I think, in terms of how, successful their program has been, but they've not I would assume specifically over the last 10, 15 years, they were probably one of the worst in terms of, whatever criteria that you want to put out there.
Absolutely. Yeah. Iowa State has been so vacant from the top 25 poll that they only have 25 poll points in the history of the program. And I got to think that a lot of those have come just in the last, if they finished like number 10 in the country the year before last,
Hmm.
I haven't looked into their poll ranking system, the AP rankings, but I believe you get 25 points for being number one and 24 for being number two and on down the line.
Yeah.
So basically, I think they got all those points in like 2 seasons, plus like in 1976 or something, they were ranked.
Yeah.
That's it.
That's
You
crazy.
even Kansas has almost 100 poll points, 96, and Iowa State's got 25.
Wow. Yeah, it's hard to think about some of these teams that have that well, not success, but the periods of mediocrity. Um, that Yeah, it's interesting.
Absolutely. All right, let's see if there's anything else here in the Buzz is expecting me to puff up the numbers for Ohio State. Heard a couple people mention this. Somebody shot right back about this is a cooked up system and something about my opinion. Like there's absolutely nothing that I can alter in this.
Yeah,
I've got
that's
winning percentage, conference championships, award winners, Heisman's. I'm not, these are all static numbers. I can't do anything about them.
yeah. I mean, no matter how you look at it, Ohio State and Alabama and probably Oklahoma for that matter are
Yeah.
all going to be top five.
Oh yeah, their numbers are, all three of them are just squash the rest of the league.
Yeah.
In their respective conferences. Absolutely. All right. Good stuff, Jason. Appreciate you being here as always, making this work for 48 consecutive weeks. And hopefully we'll be back here next Wednesday at the same time. If not, again, hit that bell for the notifications to know when we go live. We may have to adjust schedules from time to time. All right, man. We appreciate it. Is there anything going on there at Last Word on College Football that we need to know about?
Not specifically, as kind of the same thing with Oklahoma. A lot of spring camps are getting ramped up, so we had a little bit of a dead period there, but we'll start kind of ramping up a lot of stuff with spring games and practice and updates and things like that. So there'll be a lot of stuff to watch for.
All right, folks, catch your Discord link. You can talk Oklahoma football with me and a bunch of other people. Go to Patreon, search MarkRogersTV. I'll get you the link. And also be back here next week and bring some folks with you. And we will see you then.